So we talked the other day about how this time of the year means that NBA trade season is here. December 15th, all these players become eligible to be traded. It's a big point in the year. But that also means that NBA tank season is here. We're already seeing teams actively go down towards the bottom of the standings to try and improve their draft position. And I speculated in the beginning of the season that it was going to be more prevalent this year than it has in years because of how talented the top of this draft class is. Of course, you know about Victor Wembanyama. You know about Scoot Henderson. There's some other guys that are beginning to emerge in this class as well that we can talk about throughout the rest of the year. And today I just kind of want to talk about some of these teams that are tanking, what it means for the league, and kind of the fit potentially of those two guys on a handful of these teams. Now, to me, if we're giving out awards for the most egregious tank, it is certainly the San Antonio Spurs right now. San Antonio started the year surprisingly competent for a roster that I said before the season was probably the least talented in the entire league. Keldon Johnson, Devin Vassell, those guys started the season really well. They're still putting up good numbers, but overall, it's clear San Antonio isn't trying to win, and they understand the objective of this season. The objective of this season is to get a top 2 pick in this draft, and then you can go back to being the Spurs later on. They've done this before. Obviously, they won the lottery to get Tim Duncan in an injury-riddled season, and that led to 5 titles for them. And it's certainly a situation where they're actively looking at getting Wembanyama or Scoot Henderson, and I'm kind of hoping that it is them, quite frankly. I try and think about throughout the year the teams that realistically could get Victor Wembanyama, could get Scoot Henderson. Them, OKC, who we're going to talk about later, are a couple of different teams that I really would be rooting for. And I'm happy that San Antonio is going down this route because for years it felt like they never would give up this idea of always pushing for the playoffs, always trying to be a team that wouldn't tank, and they refused to adapt to this kind of newer style of team building in the NBA, especially obviously with an older coach in Greg Popovich that we all assumed would be very close to retirement. But it seems like now they realize, hey, we need this pick and Pop can stick around, we can still be the Spurs, and all we have to do is have one really off year. They're resting guys, they're actively trying to lose games, quite frankly, while still developing some of the talent on the roster, and they would certainly be a very, very interesting Wembanyama destination, or Scoot Henderson. Either way, they have certainly needs up and down the roster. They also have some trade pieces they could potentially look to move. I think Jakob Poeltl is a very interesting big man potentially for teams like Brooklyn and LA, teams that need a little bit of help with the 5 spot. Golden State as well. So they certainly are throwing themselves into this the Victor Wembanyama sweepstakes here. Another team that certainly gets an award here for the best or the worst tank, however you want to put it, is the Washington Wizards. Now for them, a lot of it has been injury related. Bradley Beal's missed some time. Kristaps Porzingis as always is missing time. But their roster in general is just not that great. Like you got Kuzma, you got Denny, Corey Kispert, the rookie Johnny Davis. I almost said Corey Davis. Johnny Davis has just not been a factor for them. It's not a very good roster, and especially if Beal and KP are hurt. And it's a situation where they certainly need an upgrade in talent. And they kind of have that Chicago Bulls syndrome where they're always that Orlando Magic syndrome where they're always drafting between like 5 and 9 right before the draft kind of drops off. And they need an influx of talent. And whether they trade away Kuzma or Denny or Beal or Porzingis or any of these guys to try and get themselves towards the bottom of the standings, I think if it results in a 1 or 2 pick in this draft, it certainly is worth it. Next up now is Charlotte, another tank candidate here. And I would argue that even more so than San Antonio and some of the other teams we're going to talk about, Charlotte needs this draft pick, needs this top 2 pick. I would argue more than any other team in the league because they have LaMelo, who's been hurt recently coming back, and they don't really have much else. Terry Rozier's fine. They've got some other relatively interesting young guys on the roster, but in terms of talent, they desperately need someone like this. I think Scoot Henderson can play alongside LaMelo. I certainly think Victor Wembanyama would help them a ton, obviously, in the front court, and they've just never had a guy like that. Like they got the 3rd pick in the draft, in the LaMelo draft, which unfortunately for them was just not a draft that had as much talent at the top. Of course, Anthony Edwards and LaMelo are very good, but it was a draft that it wasn't really if you could have picked out of the last 5, which draft you would least want to pick in the top 3, it probably would have been that one. And they've never really found themselves in a position to get a generational franchise changing player. And they've always been in that 30 to 42 win range or even worse this year. And I really, really hope that they continue to recognize that. And whether it be by accident because they're missing guys or on purpose, they certainly need to be tanking as well. Next up now is OKC. And I promise we're going to talk about some teams that other than just like the usual suspects here, but I have to mention a team like OKC and then next Houston. And then we're going to get to some other teams as well. So for Oklahoma City, again, when you think about teams that would fit really well with what Wembanyama or Scoot Henderson bring to the table, they're certainly near the top of the list as well. I mean, we haven't even seen Chet Holmgren this season because he's been hurt, and having both him and potentially either Scoot or Victor Wembanyama added to this roster next year, a roster that I already think is good, would be an incredible influx of talent. I mean, they would be on kind of the same trajectory that we see a team like New Orleans on right now as one of the better teams in the Western Conference despite their youth. And Oklahoma City has an opportunity to put themselves in a position to do that. And given their history, I think we all know what they will ultimately do, despite the fact that they are pretty competitive to begin this season. Before we get to, January, February, we're going to start to see guys missing games, and Shea is going to end up playing 45 or 50 games on the season. And next year, I would imagine, is the year that Oklahoma City is going to go all in. Even if they don't end up with the top 2 pick, which they certainly don't need, but just one more young player, when you have the opportunity to do so, and when the incentive is so high to get one of those top 2 picks, we're certainly going to see them tank. And the next up is Houston, a team that actually has a couple of decent wins this year, but feels the most undefined to me out of the interesting up and coming young teams. So like, I don't count Charlotte in the up and coming interesting young team category, but when you think about, you know, New Orleans, who's now just very good, Oklahoma City, Houston, San Antonio to a certain extent, Houston feels the most undefined to me. And what I mean by that is, like, we know that Jalen Green's good. We know that Jabari Smith is good and is continuing to improve. We don't know about a lot else. You know, there's some other guys, Tari Eason, Şengün, of course, but we don't really know, like, is Jalen Green good enough to be like that number 1 guy? Do they need to add someone even a level above him to continue to build in a positive direction here? What do we know about Jabari Smith in terms of, like, is he going to elevate into a perimeter scorer type guy? Is he going to be what a lot of people projected him to be, which is this front court spacer that can guard, but is never really like this Paul George level player? There's a lot to still figure out there. Of course, they're also young, but I would say in comparison to a team like Oklahoma City, it's less clear what they need. And for that reason, just having someone with the overwhelming talent of either Wembanyama or Scoot Henderson certainly helps them a lot. Now, having said that, there are some other teams to cover here. Utah is a big one for me. Utah is a team that coming into the season, we all expected to be one of the worst teams in the league. Like, they have good players, but we expected most of them, or some of them at least, to be traded, guys be sitting out games. That hasn't been the case to begin this season, and they could, if they wanted to, similar to the next team we're going to talk about, they could be a playoff team. Like, they have the option where they can look at these 2 situations and say, hey, we can either make the playoffs or we can try and tank and, you know, get the 8th best odds at the 1st or 2nd pick in the draft. It's very clear that that is an option that they have. And I know that it's tough to kind of, like, quote unquote, give up on a season in which you're much better than you thought that you would have been. But the thing that, you know, helps you more in the long term, the option there is very clear, and that is to tank this season. I don't know if they're going to do it. Like, it would require multiple trades. It would be very obvious because their roster is good enough, if healthy right now, as I said, to be a play-in team in the Western Conference worst case. And so if they were to try and tank, it would be one of the more obvious tank jobs we've seen, and that can be pretty demoralizing for the guys that you end up keeping around. But if we see a Mike Conley trade, a Rudy Gay trade, you know, maybe Malik Beasley gets moved, and they start moving all these pieces, then we're going to start to understand, okay, what the real goal here is. But I'm not sure if that's something they're really going to go towards. And then the next team is Indiana. I think that with as good as Tyrese Halliburton has been playing, as well as he's been playing, I should say, and the rest of the pieces they have on this roster, guys like Miles Turner, Buddy Hield, they are kind of in a similar situation as Utah, where, like, they have the option to push for the playoffs, and I think they'd have a good shot at it. And they also have the option to tank, and it wouldn't really require that much from them other than a couple of traits. Like, as much talent as they do have, having someone like Wembanyama or Scoot Henderson, one of the other talented guys in the top of this class, would completely elevate them over anything else, you know, that they would have if they just made the playoffs and then nothing matters. So you have to think about what would help our team a year from now. How does our team look 1 year from now if we make the playoffs versus tank and get one of these picks? Now, ultimately, and I'm sure this is something that a lot of you have been thinking throughout the entirety of this video, only 1 or 2 teams are going to end up with these guys. Like, only 1 team gets Wembanyama, only 1 team gets Scoot Henderson, and the rest of them are going to tank towards the bottom. Like, we're going to have, by the end of the year, 8, 9, maybe 10 teams, maybe a third of the league actively trying to lose games. And, you know, some of them are going to be really happy and excited and feel like they made the right choice, and others, maybe even a Utah, maybe even in Indiana, that made choices and traded guys away with the intention of getting one of those top picks, aren't going to get them. And that could completely change the trajectory of their franchise, because maybe they don't get as much value in exchange for Miles Turner, Buddy Hield, Mike Conley, Malik Beasley, whatever the case may be, because they want to try and be worse. And then if you don't end up with one of these 2 guys, it's obviously an issue. And it's the issue with tanking as a whole, is that as a concept, it's the best team building strategy you have, especially as a smaller market team, until 9, 10, 11 other teams in the league are also joining you in that for what is essentially 2 lottery tickets, 2 golden tickets at the top of this draft that we know of right now. And that obviously is a concern, but it's also going to create an interesting situation throughout the rest of the league as teams are pushing for playoff position. Teams at the top of the league are going to be racking up wins against teams that are not very good. And if you have a quote unquote easier schedule on the back half rather than the front half, so you're playing Oklahoma City a lot, you're playing Houston a lot, you're playing San Antonio a lot towards the end of your schedule, rather than in the beginning of the year when they're actually trying to win games, that can have a drastic impact on the seeding in each conference. And that's just the reality of where tanking is right now. But this is the time. This is the tanking era. This is the tanking, you know, time frame right now. And I'm excited about the possibility of either Wembanyama or Scoot Henderson on any one of these teams that we talked about. I think that's the unique part about this draft, is you can very easily see how either of these guys are going to fit in a variety of different situations because they're so versatile. But again, only 2 teams are going to end up with those guys, and very likely some teams are going to make moves to actively tank and end up worse off for it, simply because the lottery odds just did not go their way. So my question to you guys that made it to the end of the video is this: which team, if you could close your eyes, snap your fingers right now, and wish Victor Wembanyama on one hand and Scoot Henderson on the other, player onto an NBA team, which one separately will you most want to see them on? For me, I would probably say Wembanyama to Oklahoma City because they have so much versatility already with their roster. When you think about him alongside Chet and guys like Jang and Lou Dort and Josh Giddey and Shea and all these different versatile pieces that they have, I feel like that's the team for me that would be the most fun. And then for Scoot, I kind of want to see him in San Antonio because I want them to get something out of this because I think they're going to do the best job or one of the best jobs developing that particular player. And I'd be really interested to see like a player that dynamic in a situation in San Antonio, how much they would really allow some of that dynamic play style to come through, how much of it would be a little bit more structured. And I think that would be really interesting to see as well. Let me know down in the comment section below. Keep it realistic, please. Don't just say you want Wembanyama to go to the Lakers or whatever. But I'm really curious in y'all's answers down below. Thank you all for watching the video, and I'll see you next time.